I listened to every CAPSULE album, all 16 of them. CAPSULE is a long-running J-pop duo consisting of the extremely prolific producer Yasutaka Nakata, who's also known for his work in groups like Perfume, and singer Toshiko Koshijima. They were formed in 1997 and since 2001 have released 16 albums of wildly varying types of pop music. And I've listened to them all, and I'm gonna tell you about them, and then we're gonna put them in a tier list because I have YouTube brain rot and that's how I rank things. So let's start with their debut, 2001's Haikara Girl. This really stands out in their discography in a couple of obvious ways. One is that it's by far the longest CAPSULE album. This clocks in at 67 minutes, while the second longest, Player, is only 54. And second, almost all of CAPSULE's albums are very heavily based in electronic music, but Haikara Girl is a big outlier in that way, instead more inspired by the shibuya-kei movement of the 90s, which means instead of very hyperactive electronics, you're getting a smoother lounge sound on this record. And you can really see that on Koi no Hana, which is one of the best tracks on the album. It's a lot lusher than many other CAPSULE tracks, with slowed down melodies and comparatively raw vocals. After listening to every other album they've done, it barely even sounds like a CAPSULE song. Hanabi is particularly good too, and another example of just how different this record is. It's a slow and relaxing J-pop song that feels like the antithesis of a lot of what would come later. For all of these albums, I'm gonna go through my best song and my worst song. So the best song for this one is Tokyo Kisa. It's still definitely early stages, but it's a sign of what would come later in their discography. It includes some more processed vocals and synth-crushed production. It's right towards the end of the album, which when you're listening to their whole discography in order, makes it feel like a good segue into some of their later records. The worst is Koareta Tokai, which is just a boring ballad track. Haikara Girl is gonna get in B tier. It's solid, but they definitely have better. Now, once that one's out of the way, I think you can kind of sort CAPSULE's discography into two eras. There's two big outliers, and Haikara Girl is one, but the first phase really starts with their second album, Cutie Cinema Replay. This record and the ones that would follow it are still clearly taking from the shibuya-kei scene, but the songs are a lot faster, and they're mostly reliant on frantic electronics. You can see that on Candy Cutie, which is driven by high-pitched synths and a cool breakbeat. L.D.K Go-Go is another good example, doing many of the same things as Candy Cutie, but with some light funk and a really infectious hook. This record's a lot more consistent than Haikara Girl, and it's a lot more condensed. Hell, it's almost half as long, which definitely helps the quality of it overall. These sweet bursts of energy are all packed together, and they're not interrupted by random iffy tracks like they were a lot of times on Haikara Girl. The best song here is L.D.K Go-Go, while the worst is French Lesson because the instrumental sounds too much like it'd be playing in the carousel at an awful theme park. Really, my biggest issue with this record is that Toshiko only sings on 2 tracks on it, making it more of a nakata solo album, which kinda defeats the purpose of CAPSULE being a duo. And this really isn't the only album that's gonna have that problem, but that's way later on. Cutie Cinema Replay gets an A tier, it's a good step up from Haikara Girl, and it's a fun album. Next up, their third album, Phony Phonic. Both this and Cutie Cinema Replay came out in 2003, and in fact, they only came out 8 months apart from each other. Early CAPSULE put out a lot of records in really quick succession, and you can really tell when you're listening to this, because this sounds very similar to Cutie Cinema Replay. This could have really just been one double album, and these songs would have fit together perfectly fine. It's still pretty shibuya-kei inspired, and it's an album full of high-tempo pop tracks that make use of really energetic synths. And while there is still some good stuff here, not as much of it hits for me as on their last album. One good track is Cosmic Tone Cooking, which you could honestly throw halfway through the track list on their last one, and it wouldn't sound out of place at all. There's also Lifestyle Music, which branches out a bit with funky synth lines and a hip-hop inspired breakbeat. And those tracks are really good, but then this album also has stuff like Idle Fancy, which just feels phoned in comparison to many other CAPSULE songs, and Weekend in My Room, which is kind of trying to do a more Haikara Girl lounge instrumental, but it just doesn't really work at all. The The best song on this is Cosmic Tone Cooking, and the worst song is actually the song right after that one, Ice Cream, which is mixed terribly and is just too simple for me. Phony Phonic feels like B-sides to Cutie Cinema Replay, a feeling that is not helped by it being the shortest album in the entire Capsule discography. And because of that, I'm putting it in B tier for B-sides. Moving on to 2004, and we get their next album, Sound Furniture. This was released less than 7 months after Phony Phonic. That one came out in November 2003, and this is from June 2004. However, while Phony Phonic felt more like a B-sides album to Cutie Cinema Replay, Sound Furniture is actually my favorite Capsule album. It's more of the same fast electronic pop, but Nakata's experimenting a bit more with the instrumentals here, which leads to this having, in my opinion, the best production of any Capsule album. For example, check out Portable Airport, a dancey 5-minute track that blends the vocals into the instrumental and has them serve as more of a complement to the bouncy drums and electric synth lead. That synth lead being the real star of the show on this song. It's using Toshiko's voice as more of an instrument than the centerpiece of the song, which is an effect that I love. It stands out as not just the best track on this album, but one of the best tracks in the entire Capsule discography. Space Elevator is also great, with another super busy instrumental that's more of a traditional pop song. It's a lot louder than Portable Airport and is more reliant on a great vocal hook than its synth leads. And speaking of great hooks, Go Go Fine Day is the opening track on this album, and it's super energetic, putting earworm vocals over a bouncy instrumental, and the whole thing's tied together by some really fun percussion. And there's great tracks all over the record. It's a very consistent album, especially when you compare it to many others that Capsule have made, and heck, even the next album I'm going to be talking about. The best song on this album is definitely Portable Airport. The worst is Mirai Seikatsu, because it feels too much like a remix of a children's nursery rhyme. This absolutely goes in S tier. It is their best album, full stop. And exactly 8 months after that record, in February 2005, Capsule dropped their next album, Nexus 2060. It is, would you believe it, more of the same sound from the last 3, which really isn't too surprising considering all 4 records came out in a 2-year span. This has, in my opinion, the best start of any Capsule album. Space Station Number 9 is incredible and one of the best songs Capsule has ever done. It's got some heavier and darker percussion that's an immediate contrast from the non-stop bright electropop of their last 3 albums. It layers Toshiko's vocals over some that have been sampled from somewhere else, and they have a really hypnotic contrast. It's another much looser song structure, similar to Portable Airport, and it's great. Nakata kills it when he goes for those kinds of songs. Also at the start is Automatic Infection, which is a song that you could drop halfway through the track list of any of their last 3 albums, and you wouldn't be able to tell that it was from somewhere else. It's still really good though, and one of the best of this style of Capsule song. Lucky Love is at the start of this album, and it's also good. It's a super fun dance pop cut. It's an amazing start, but then it immediately falls off. You've got the 8-minute Beautiful Hour, which sounds like something Nakata made to play at a club somewhere, and then it got thrown on this album to pad the runtime, because it does not fit here at all. You've also got the 3 separate interludes on this 10-song, 37-minute album. Most Capsule albums are about 10 songs, and in addition to padding the runtime with Beautiful Hour, they're padding the track number with the 8-second long Q&A, which is literally just the singer spelling out the band name. There's also the 2-minute Urban Complex, which is bad and also extremely out of place. So while it starts great, I can't justify putting this in any sort of high tier. The best song is Space Station Number 9, the worst is Urban Complex, and I'm gonna stick it in B tier because of how rapidly it falls off from its S tier start. This is what putting out albums every 6 months can get you. Sometimes you just have some misses. And next, 7 months after that, in September 2005, is Lounge Designer's Killer. This is a bit of a transitional album for Capsule, and also the end of their first era. It's still very similar to many of the records released before it, but with a bit more of a focus on electropop, and dance, and even house music at points. There's a banger to start off the album, that being Flying City Plan. It's a house track that's kind of similar to Space Station Number 9 and Portable Airport. It features a really nice wordless melody from from the singer, and some flying synths. And as that track might suggest, it's another album that starts on a high note. And that's good because the highs on this are among the best of any CAPSULE album. Take the second track, Teleportation, which is one of the most hyperactive songs CAPSULE has ever done. It's an electropop overload that sounds like a fully evolved version of the stuff they were doing on their last 4 records. The issue with Lounge Designer's Killer, though, is that while the highs are awesome, the lows are pretty weak. Kinda similar to Nexus 2060. Twinkle Twinkle Pop is more annoying than anything else, while Tic Tac is so simple and amateurish that it sounds completely out of place among the sound overload happening on many songs here. I think if you combine the best parts of this record and the best parts of Nexus 2060, you have not just an S-tier album, but one of the defining records of the entire Japanese pop genre. But again, consistent quality can get sacrificed at times when you're trying to put out an album every 7 months. The best song on this is Teleportation, the worst is Twinkle Twinkle Pop, and I'm gonna stick this in A tier based off the highs of the better songs on it. And now we get into the second era of CAPSULE, 8 months later on May 2006's Fruits Clipper. And this is the start of a big shift in CAPSULE's sound. That active and synthetic brand of shibuya-kei is being moved away from in favor of primarily house-flavored electronic music. Fruits Clipper, despite this big shift in sound, still comes out feeling similar in quality to Lounge Designer's Killer. There's some great tracks on this thing, but there are also some very notable misses that go along with it. 5 Star is a highlight on this album, with a duet on vocals between Toshiko and a male singer. That's something that CAPSULE hasn't done before, but it works really well with those heavily processed vocals overlaid onto an upbeat synth melody. But then this album also has tracks like Robot Disco, which sounds like dollar store Daft Punk, and I'm not sure why anyone would actually ever listen to this over an actual Daft Punk song. The best song on this album is the closer, Dreaming Dreaming, which is a really fun pop song with some super catchy vocals. While the worst has to be Robot Disco, because it's one of the dumbest songs CAPSULE has ever made. This is going in B tier because the highlights can't drag it up over its general inconsistency. And next, in February 2007, a whopping 9 months after Fruits Clipper, we get their 8th album, Sugarless Girl. And I have to censor that album cover or else YouTube will hate me. Sugarless Girl serves as the halfway point in their discography, and it's also one of their best albums. CAPSULE made a lot of house records, but I think this is the best distillation of that sound that they've done to date. They worked out a lot of the kinks that were present on Fruits Clipper, and this, to me at least, feels like just a better version of that album. It starts off high with the excellent Starry Sky, which is the best song CAPSULE has ever made. It's a nearly 6-minute house track that feels a lot more creative instrumentally than many of the ones on Fruits Clipper. It sounds more as if Nakata is taking some of the lessons he learned with the earlier CAPSULE albums and applying them to his new house approach. It's got a soaring chorus that fills you with life, and the somewhat clunky vocals are the only thing stopping this from being a perfect song. What sets Sugarless Girl apart is that while many other CAPSULE albums start strong and then fall off in the second half, Sugarless Girl doesn't. This record is consistently great the whole way through. Spider is right in the middle of the album, and it works an electric guitar into its bouncy house instrumental, and it also has some rawer vocals than what CAPSULE usually goes for. There's also the last track, Secret Paradise, which kinda does the exact opposite of Spider with the vocals. It processes them to hell and back. That track's carried by a fun melody and some excellent percussion that really levels up from just the typical deep kicks present in many house songs. The best track on this one is definitely Starry Sky, which is such a banger, and the worst is Music, which is really the only miss on the album. It's out of left field and it kind of just breaks the flow of everything. Doesn't need to be here at all. Sugarless Girl gets into S tier. Spoiler alert, it's the last album that'll get into S tier because we're about to get into my least favorite stretch of CAPSULE's whole discography. In the span of just over 9 months, we go from one of their best albums in Sugarless Girl to one of their worst albums, December 2007's Flashback. This album is not good. Sugarless Girl was a house album that felt fun and full of life, whereas Flashback feels like the barest and deadest house party that the suburbs have ever seen. There is one good track here, and it is the title track. That track is also an instrumental, so it barely even counts as a CAPSULE song. I kinda like the hook on Get Down too, and there's a couple tracks that are generally inoffensive. That's about all that this album is going for it. Electric Light Moonlight feels like a half half-baked attempt at doing an 80s synthpop throwback. Music's is another mostly instrumental track that spends 5.5 minutes being repetitive and boring, and Love Me feels like it was an unfinished demo that just got thrown onto the album at the last second to pad time. The bizarre vocals swirling around the track for the entire duration just make it worse. This is not a good album, and in fact I would say that this is the second worst CAPSULE album. The best song is Flashback, the worst song is Love Me, and this one has to go in bad tier because I never want to listen to it again. Next, 11 months later in November 2008, we get More. It's got 3 exclamation points, so you gotta say it like that. And I'll give that title one thing. It does have more good songs than Flashback. This is another house record, but one that has Nakata mixing it up after the stale bread that was Flashback. This one leans a bit more into electropop as well, featuring a singer in at least some capacity on every track. Also on this album, CAPSULE's focusing more on longer cuts, with 4 songs on it going for over 6 minutes. And one of those songs is amazing, because it's the one real standout on this album that I think needs to be talked about. It's the 4th song, Jumper. This is the second best song from this entire era of CAPSULE, only behind Starry Sky. It's a 7-minute house cut with endless energy. The production is busy, it's fun, it's one of the coolest things Nakata has ever made, and the constant vocals running all over the track only add to the lightning in a bottle that this track has going on. It's impossible not to get moving to this song, because it's so infectious, and it keeps the energy on max for the entire 7 minutes. It's one of the best CAPSULE tracks ever, for sure. The problem is, nothing else on this record is particularly close to Jumper in terms of quality, but it isn't as bad as Flashback. Whereas that album had a ton of songs that were just not good, pretty much everything on this record is at least fine. The songs are more energetic and they're usually a pretty good time. They're not the 5 instrumentals full of bland slop that were present on much of their last one. Outside of Jumper, it's an album full of songs that I'm never really gonna seek out, but if they autoplayed on my Spotify, I'd be fine sitting through. There's nothing bad here at all. The best song, as mentioned, is Jumper. The worst is The Time Is Now, which is the first song in CAPSULE's discography that tries to do a rap thing. It's a cool idea, but it just isn't executed well at all, and it ends up just sounding messy. More goes in B tier. Now for our 11th album in this video, 2010's Player. Can you believe it? CAPSULE went over a year between album releases. Shocking. Who would have thought? Unfortunately, they aren't any better for it, because this is the second album I'm putting in bad tier. This is a very weird record in terms of quality. There's 2 great songs here, and then everything else just sucks. Stay With You is one of the good ones. It's a really solid electropop track. It's got some fun synths. I don't mind it at all. I Wish You is also good. It's more of a stripped back synthpop song, not something that's very common in CAPSULE's discography, but it's also really catchy and it's my favorite track on the record. The third best song here is The Interlude, which is also one of the most popular CAPSULE songs on Spotify somehow. There are 3 songs on this record that are over 7.5 minutes, and none of them are anywhere close to good. The title track, Player, is another extremely janky attempt at doing a rap song. This song has no personality whatsoever, and that's not helped by it being anchored by a random dude from a sample CD providing the rapping. The music is the third awful CAPSULE track that has music in the title, as the song is overwhelmed by some boring-ass synth melodies. And Factory has many of the same problems as Player, where it's Nataka throwing a sampled vocalist over a nondescript instrumental to bad results. This album is lifeless, it has almost no character to it at all, and there's very little reason to ever come back to it in full. It's bad. The best song is I Wish You, and the worst is What Do You Want to Do, which is super annoying and makes prominent use of a synth that sounds like a fart. Player is bad, and as a result, it's going in bad tier. Next up, 2011's World of Fantasy. This is a very weird record. In terms of sound, it's not too far from what was on their last few albums, but the quality here is all over the place, and some of the songs are just downright bizarre. Take Striker, which is pretty fine, but randomly decides to blast an air horn at max volume over the track for seemingly no reason. Or I Will, which is a deep and edgy house instrumental that's a contrast from the typically very bright material on these albums. Or even I Can't Say I Like You, which is a weird, anxious electropop track that almost accidentally feels like it turned out good. This album is throwing a lot of crazy ideas around, and while they don't always work, it's still a vast improvement from the failures going on with Player. The best song here is the opener, World of Fantasy, an energetic and super loud track that feels conceptually very similar to Starry Sky from Sugarless Girl. It's not as good as that one, but it's undoubtedly still great. The worst is I Just Wanna Fuck You, which is the worst song CAPSULE's ever made. It's laugh out loud bad. I get that Nakata is trying to be more mature and edgier on some of these later records, but this is just laughably awful, all the way to the extremely loud bleep noise that plays instead of the singer actually saying the word fuck. World of Fantasy goes in B tier. It is an extremely mixed record that comes out okay. And 10 months after that, in March 2012, we got Stereo Worxxx. This is their best record since Sugarless Girl. It's a more developed and refined version of the sound that was on World of Fantasy, taking the things that did work from that album, such as the title track, and cutting the things like didn't, such as songs like I Will. It's got a really strong start, something that's been lacking on CAPSULE albums for a while. Feelin' Alright is a fantastic groovy house cut that has one of the most addictive beats they've ever done. Never Let Me Go is a pretty fun electropop song, and Step on the Floor does a great job of blending in some retro synths into an upbeat pop track. And while it does still drop off a little bit in the second half, songs like Transparent and All the Way are still more than enough to keep the energy up. The best song here is Feelin' Alright, while the worst is Motor Force, which is a pointless 5-minute song that doesn't really accomplish anything at all during that runtime. I'm actually going to put Stereo Worxxx in A tier. I really like this one. It's a very welcome album after many of the albums that preceded it being not good. 3 albums to go now, and we move on to 2013's CAPSULE. This is their only album that isn't on American Spotify. Thanks, Warner. I said World of Fantasy was a weird one. This is a really, really weird one. It doesn't really feel like a CAPSULE album. It feels more like a Nakata solo album. It's more like he was just kind of fucking around and making something that he wanted to make. Half the songs on this album are instrumental, and several of the songs that aren't don't really make great use of the vocals either way. Control is one of the only tracks here that feels like an actual pop song, with its simple repeating synth loops and percussion that's a notable shift away from the house style that dominated their last several records. And the only other actual pop song here is Shift, which has some heavy vocal manipulation. It's throwing these very distorted and clipped vocal lines around on top of an upbeat synth pop song. But then this album also has some weird stuff like Space, which feels like the championship theme in a throwback arcade racing game. And along with that is Return, which is a very relaxed electronic instrumental that's a big outlier in CAPSULE's discography. It really feels more like a Nakata solo track than anything else. Delete is the same way. This sounds so out of place on this album compared to just anything else CAPSULE has done before. It's a big shift, and while it isn't a bad album, I think I'd be more down with it if it was branded as a Nakata solo album and not a CAPSULE album. That docks it a little for me, because if you see CAPSULE as a collaborative pop group, that's not what's happening on this record. The best song is Control, and the worst is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, because the cuckoo clock sample that gets repeated every 4 seconds drives me insane. CAPSULE gets its own tier. We're throwing it in between B and bad because C is for CAPSULE. 2 records to go now. Following up CAPSULE, we get Wave Runner. This came out in February 2015 and was the last album of the second era of CAPSULE. And it is absolutely awful. No caveats, this is their worst record, and it's not particularly close. This sucks. Do you remember Avicii? Do you remember his brand of like big festival house music? Songs like Levels, that sort of thing? Nakata heard those and went, wow, that's really cool. I should do that, but worse. And that's how Wave Runner was born. While it is still house music, it's a very large shift from every other CAPSULE house album. It's no longer this rhythmic kind of electronic house. It's now festival house, which means every song is really boring, and then it has one big drop, and then it's boring again. The issue is that where other Capsule albums were energetic in a way that felt fun and vivid, this is energetic in the way that music that plays while you're shopping at the grocery store is energetic. It feels like it's made of cheap plastic. Another World is the most tolerable song here. The chorus doesn't suck, it's listenable, it's okay. But so much of this is just sludge. Dancing Planet is like an even more neutered version of the pointless instrumental tracks on other Capsule records. Unrequited Love sounds so exciting on the surface, but whereas other Capsule tracks get me moving and happy, this just makes me awkwardly sit still and stare at my monitor. This thing is not good. I guess the best song here is Another World. This is the only Capsule album where there are just no good songs, or even anything particularly close. Worst, I'm just gonna say, is the tie between everything else, because the rest of the songs are all horrible, and I didn't take notes on which one I thought was the worst. And I cannot be bothered to listen to all of them again to tell you which one is actually the worst. I do not want to listen to Wave Runner any more than I have to. This goes in bad tier, and Capsule is lucky that I'm not making a very bad tier specifically for this album. And then Capsule went on hiatus. Leaving Wave Runner as somehow the final piece of their legacy, until December 2022, when they came back in a big way with the album Metropulse, which is so much better. This is the second big notable outlier in Capsule's discography, where it sounds like absolutely nothing that came before it. Because in that 7-year gap, Nakata has decided to get really into retro synthwave, and that's what is happening on Metropulse. Straight from the opener, these guys are back in a big way. Hikari no Disco is probably the second best song since Sugarless Girl, and it's close to Jumper. It's a very well-produced track with the kind of solid pop songwriting that it feels like Capsule has been missing since really Lounge Designer's Killer. And the entire first half of this album bangs. Future Wave is also spectacular with some sick grooves and unstoppable energy. And while the album does start to slip a bit in the second half, it's still good. There's no real lows on this album, and there's no long, pointless instrumental tracks like the ones that litter many other Capsule albums in the second half of their career. Heck, I'd even say that the worst song on this is better than the best song on Wave Runner. It's a huge and a very welcome step up. The best song on Metropulse is Hikari no Disco. There's really a lot of Capsule albums where the best song is the first one, aren't there? Meanwhile, the worst is Starry Night. The horn sounds awful, and this whole track is just weirdly crushed. The vocals are also a low point here. Overall though, Metropulse is a great return to form, and one of the better albums Capsule's made. Easy A tier. So that's it. As of 2024, that is every Capsule album. Let me run through that tier list one more time for you. S tier is Sound Furniture and Sugarless Girl. A tier is Cutie Cinema Replay, Lounge Designer's Killer, Stereo Worxxx, and Metropulse. B tier is Haikara Girl, Phony Phonic, Nexus 2060, Fruits Clipper, More, and World of Fantasy. C tier is just Caps Lock, and then bad tier is Flashback, Player, and Wave Runner. Thank you so much for watching. I've put a playlist of my favorite song from every album in a pinned comment. I also included them a bit in my beginner's guide to shibuya-kei if you're interested in a video like that and you want to find out more about the style of their earlier records. Thank you again for watching. I love y'all so much. This video was a lot of work. Bye!